So welcome to Columbia at Home. My name is Riley Jones. I'm the president of the Black Alumni Council here at Columbia University. We're glad you've joined us for We All Can Lead, finding our own roles in creating change. We're joined by two really good friends of mine, Angela Myers-Morales. She's class of 18 from Barnard College and is currently the second vice president of the Minneapolis NAACP. And Derek Lipscomb, who is an educator and a founder of The Work. He's a 2011 graduate of Columbia College. And we're going to be talking about a lot of things, but anti-Black violence, systemic racism, and police brutality, as well as the recent widespread Black Lives Matter protests and calls for action. The discussion will be moderated by another alum, Lisa Dolberry Hancock, who's a fellowship director for the Columbia World Projects and the director of the Obama Foundation Scholars Program at Columbia. And she's a 1993 graduate of the School of International and Public Affairs. Near the end of the program, we'll have an audience Q&A, and you can use the Q&A at the bottom of your screen to submit a question, and we'll try to get to as many as we can in the time that we have. Now, pleased to welcome our panelists who can share more about themselves and their experiences. See you soon.
Thank you, Riley, for that introduction. And thank you, Angela and Derek, for participating in this conversation today. Given the leadership theme of the discussion and the work that both of you have chosen to undertake to address issues of racial equity, I'm really pleased and honored to learn more about you, about the work that you're doing, and to hear your perspectives on the role that each of us as individuals can play in making the changes we want to see in this country and the world around us. So thank you again for being part of this dialogue. Before we move into the conversation though, I want to just pause for a moment and just ask you both how you're doing at the moment. It's been such an unsettling time with the current health crises, and the work that both of you do is squarely focused on the very challenging issues we're trying to grapple with as a nation around race and social justice. So how are you doing right now at this moment?
Angela, you can go first.
I would say that, the last couple of weeks I'm in Minneapolis. For those who might not know, I live a walkable distance from the place where George Floyd was murdered. And I live pretty close by to the 3rd precinct that was burned on fire. So I would say that since the murder of George Floyd, my time and my days have been completely so short. I'm going from one thing to another thing, and my mind hasn't settled, my heart hasn't settled. So I would probably say that I'm okay considering the circumstances. And I'm definitely trying to put out positivity and light into the world, because there's a lot of negative energy that definitely is around me, that is around Minneapolis right now. And I'm trying to combat that.
Yeah,
Thank you, Angela. Sorry, go ahead, Derek.
No. I was just going to second that, and just in terms of, like, even stemming back from Ahmaud Arbery, earlier this year, having to go distance learning in a school that is still trying to figure out how to do this whole thing on Zoom. That's its own piece, but then also trying to figure out how to really be able to bring the conversation about a lot of these killings by the police into the classroom or into the parent community. That's another deal as well. And so, having that responsibility and trying to juggle those things, not to mention the fireworks going off since, Memorial Day, it feels like, having to kind of figure out the time to just kind of parse through a lot of those things can leave a person just kind of exhausted at the end of the day. But, you know, I do think that there's a certain amount of energy that is kind of swelled up over the past couple of weeks that I've been feeding off of, just kind of seeing my friends take to a lot of the social activism, but then also seeing people that, you know, generally stay out of the conversations involving race, figuring out a way to just find their way in. And so, you know, that's encouraging to see. And now it's about being able to sustain that energy for the next couple of weeks and continue the conversation as well.
Thank you both for sharing how you're feeling right now. And it sounds like both of you are cautiously optimistic. And you know, we're really looking forward to hearing more about what you're doing on the ground. But I know that given the current circumstances, so much of what you're doing now is remote. So as we have this conversation, it would also be interesting to hear how you're having to pivot and do the work that you're doing, given the challenges right now of engaging with folks on the ground. So thank you both for sharing how you're feeling. So with that, I'm going to ask a couple of questions as part of a moderated conversation, and we'll take about 25 minutes or so for that, and then we'll move into Q&A. So with that, maybe I'll start with you, Angela, and if you could both just talk a little bit more about your organizations and the work that you're doing right now.
Yes, of course. So I am the second vice president of the Minneapolis NAACP. The NAACP was started out of the Niagara movement in 1909 with activists, well-known Black scholars like W.E.B. Du Bois, Ida B. Wells, and then also a coalition of white allies as well. Then the NAACP actually came to Minneapolis in 1913, recognizing the onslaught of racism in northern cities. The first NAACP branches were started in a lot of northern cities. So Minneapolis, St. Paul, Duluth, Minnesota, Rochester, Minnesota. These are all some of the first NAACP branches that were started actually in the country. And now the NAACP is one of the largest, and it is the oldest civil rights organization in the country. Some of the work that the Minneapolis NAACP does is around, you know, economic inequality, racial injustice, and public policy. So the work that I do specifically in my role as a second vice president, I do the things that our president, Leslie Redmond, you know, might not be able to make, you know, happen. But I also have my own initiatives around housing. I'm doing a lot around, I've done before even this time, work around housing, affordable housing, access, and then also organizing affordable apartment complexes and tenant, you know, organizing tenants and things like that. So that was some of the work that I did, as well as basically meeting with like the police chief and the sheriff and other, you know, elected officials in Minneapolis, talking about how we can increase the equitable access to housing, also to services, and around police brutality. So those are the conversations that I was having before all of this started. And, you know, I'm still having them now. Since the murder of George Floyd, we had a rapid response that we had to basically build. In Minneapolis, grocery stores were being burned down, so we had to help start up a food shelf, you know, a pop-up food shelf. Also, Black businesses we found were being targeted by white supremacists and were being burned down, broken into, vandalized. And so we started a security team of volunteers to basically guard Black businesses, and then also Black heritage sites like our churches, as well as our mosques that are in North Minneapolis. So that was kind of the rapid response I was doing. I was getting volunteers, getting supplies, fundraising. Sometimes that meant being on the ground, but mainly a lot of it meant, you know, calling people up, calling my networks from where I am.
Thank you, Angela. Derek. love to hear more about your organization and the work that you're doing.
Yeah, sure. I created a website almost about a month ago. It's called The Work, and it specializes in racial literacy. And I noticed just from all the different spheres that I'm in, I was kind of having the same conversations a lot of the time. I'm also a rugby player, and so for example, on my team, Old Blue, which is situated right here in New York City. Whenever there would be any racially traumatic event that would show up, some of the questions you get are, what can I do? How can I help? Where should I start? And so while those questions are made in earnest, it does put a significant amount of labor on the person being asked to kind of take up, that load in terms of leading a person through a conversation through this racially traumatic event, or, where to start when discussing race. And so I'm used to those conversations, just given that, I'm also a teacher. I largely work with grades 1, 2, and 3, but I work with all of our grades 1 through 9. And so, in different spheres. And so, being able to find something concrete that I could use to be able to guide that conversation was the most helpful. But then also, like, being able to put some of my own, like, I guess, work into action was something that I was also wanting to do. And so a friend of mine and I co-founded a team called Roots Rugby, which is a rugby team that is for the African diaspora to be able to, like, find themselves on bigger platforms to play rugby at higher levels. And so that was moving from passion to action. I want to be able to expose more Black rugby players to, the upper echelons of rugby, but, you've got to be able to do a bit of research, and you can't just say, like, let's put something together and then put them out on the field, but rather, like, really understanding what's the history of the institution you're about to walk into. I think it's always important to kind of understand the education behind it before you enact that action, just because that way you're learning about, the processes and some of the stumbling blocks that will inevitably appear before you. And so, the goal of the website, The Work, is largely to give more ownership over your own educational journey. I think that's most important, especially given now that there's a wealth of information, even if it is scattered everywhere. But I'm hoping, the website could be a place where people that are coming from different parts in their journey to be able to, like, interact with that website, kind of see, if I'm just starting off with this, where should I begin versus, like, I've been doing this work for, a decade and then some now, was there anything on there for me? And so the answer is yes. I think being able to have different levels of engagement kind of brings that community closer, but then also, given, it's only so long before the next racially traumatic event shows up, we don't have to start from square one. Those people that have been doing the work since following George Floyd's murder, now they know coming into it, this is what I should know, this is what I should do, and they're already starting to put their action steps into place. But then they'll also be change agents and being able to help other people get started on that conversation too, because there are folks out there that George Floyd wasn't a good enough example, so they're still out in terms of wanting to be a part of that conversation. But there might be another situation that shows up for them, affects them personally, and they decide, I want to be a part of this now. And so those people that started just shortly after George Floyd can even be helpful in guiding some of the newcomers into that conversation along as well.
Thanks, Derek, for sharing sort of what motivated you to do the work that you're doing. I'm aware that we have many alums viewing this conversation, and I thought it'd be interesting just to hear maybe briefly your path and what led you to becoming an educator and doing the work that you're doing right now.
Yeah, sure. And I think it's important to note that I'm in a predominantly white upper middle class to upper class school, and I am one of three or four Black folks in our faculty too. So I've definitely just come across folks that are more than willing to do their part to get a part of this conversation, but I've also realized that there are some where the energy's there, but they just need the tools and they need to know how to implement the tools too. And so rather than, kind of have the conversation about where to start, what to do, and kind of tailor it to how I feel, I thought that it would be useful, especially just given that, I teach a myriad of children, to really kind of help them find their own path, right? And so as a teacher, you want to, incite curiosity and be able to help, your students, kind of buy into it without you necessarily saying, you do this and you need to do this, but rather than kind of figuring out, this is the path I need to take and this is what's most comfortable for me. And so having that same setup go into the thought process of the work itself, being able to think about how essentially there's so many different ways to approach this conversation. And so for some, not having a large book to read through, but rather having something small and something that they can kind of chew on and digest a bit, like, that's where, my Black history highlights come in. And, those are just things that get the conversation started and can pique a bit of curiosity there. But there might be some that are just like, I need text, I need, more data-driven, research. That's where my resources come in, and being able to think about, these are all the books I read and here's how I feel about them. But then also I have parents that are just like, I want to talk about race, but I want to talk about this to my, my 5-year-old kid, or being able to start the conversation in my family. I've got a section on there for resources for parents. So, and it's got a number of different, disciplines they can go into there. And so basically I'm creating it so that, there's no excuse like not to be able to use that. And, and it's still growing. There's still parts to that website I'm going to be adding in the next few days. But the biggest thing is being able to say that this is something I can at least build a platform on and go from there. And the more people that, get involved there, the better. So it can be more community driven.
And Angela, if you could share with us maybe your journey, your 2018 grad, sort of your path that led you to where you are right now, and also what motivated you to take on the work that you're currently doing right now.
Yes, so I'm from Minneapolis. Well, I'm really from St. Paul, but most people, they don't really realize that St. Paul and Minneapolis are different towns. But so I'm from the Twin Cities, and I grew up the daughter of a professor, the granddaughter of a college president who was college president of Morgan. Bowie. It was Bowie. Both my grandfather and my father went to Morgan. So Black institutions. And I've always been brought up having a love for our people, having a love for my culture and history. But I did find that there was a tension between, what I was taught and from my parents and what I was taught in school. So I went to a predominantly white school. And so there was always a tension there. And yet I really wanted to go to a college where I was close to both what was happening and also being vigorously intellectually stimulated. So I went to Barnard, and I majored in Africana Studies and Women, Gender, Sexuality Studies. And it was really at Barnard that I kind of grew into some of the things that I was thinking about. Barnard gave me a language about what was happening around me that I didn't actually fully comprehend before. Gave me theory, and it gave me, references. And there were so many Black professors that were doing anti-racist work who I love so much, like Obside George, Kim Hall, Monica Miller, Celia Naylor, Mignon Moore. There's so many professors that I looked up to and that really inspired me. And also being in Harlem inspired me. And so these were the things where when I went home, I wanted to somehow connect and bridge that academic work that I was so in love with, my community. Unfortunately, when I was in college, we had the murder of Philando Castile, the murder of Jamar Clark, and then also we had a mosque bombing that happened in Minneapolis. So these were instances where I was in college and I was reading about, police abolition, prison abolition. I was doing critical race theory, but I didn't feel like I had any power. So when I came back home, my first thing that I did is I met with the president of the Twin Cities Urban League, who happened to be a friend of my dad's. And all I said to him, I said, I just really love our people. I just really love Black people. And I just don't know how it is that we've gotten to a place where we're so disrespected, ignored. And the fact is that in Minnesota, there's a nice white supremacy. It's called Minnesota nice. And, that's kind of why we're in the situation that we're in now. The recognition in New York was they didn't realize that a Black girl could be from Minnesota because they didn't realize there were Black people in Minnesota. But in Minnesota, it's in a lot of places, it's still that recognition that this is not really an issue, and it's not really a Minnesota issue. So that's kind of how I really felt like, okay, I need to bridge some of this work that I'm doing with the work in the community. And that's kind of how I started.
I would even go so far as just like being able to qualify like what white supremacy looks like in those spaces where it is nice and it's you don't necessarily see it as something that could be threatening, but whether it be like, oh, we don't talk about those things here, or largely staying silent when they have the platform to be able to speak up, for fear out of my higher ups are going to say something to me about if I speak on this, or if I even utter the words Black Lives Matter, like how that can carry political connotations. And those are all different ways that it kind of shows up, and you don't necessarily need a hood or Blacks or whites only type of setup. Like it can be something that is more subliminal, and you see it in different ways how it manifests in the workplace. But as we move towards more anti-racist actions, being able to just acknowledge it is usually one of the first steps. But you might even find like a bit of defense when you do that
Yeah.
portion.
I agree. This is, for a lot of people in Minnesota, and I'm sure also for maybe some Columbia alumni, even this conversation is an uncomfortable conversation, but, step into it. Don't shy away from the unknown and the uncomfortable. There are many times that I was made to feel uncomfortable when I was at Barnard, and it was at times for my detriment because, someone wanted to be racist. But there were times when it was for my growth. And there are a lot of conversations where I was uncomfortable, but I needed to be uncomfortable because that was the point of which I was to grow from. It's that tension, that uncomfortableness that I truly believe now that is like that point for the greatest potential for freedom, for growth, and for, justice. So I say step into it.
Thank you both for those last comments. And as we go into the Q&A, I look forward to hearing you unpack what you just mentioned even more. That whole notion of getting comfortable being uncomfortable, I couldn't agree with you more. And if we're going to have the kind of progress that we want to see in this country, we all have to get more comfortable being uncomfortable, having the conversations we need to have. We have a few more minutes to talk before we move into the Q&A. And I touched on this earlier, but I'm curious to know, given this current health crisis, how have you had to pivot in terms of managing your work or undertaking the work that you're doing and to continue it, with lockdowns, with, sort of minimal engagement with folks in community. So curious to hear you both just talk about that. And Angela, maybe I'll start with you.
Yeah, so I'm definitely learning a lot. I come from a family where my mom, she has an autoimmune disease. When I was younger, she had a series of strokes and I was sometimes her main caregiver. So, I take COVID very seriously. My mother-in-law, who I live with, she is a survivor of breast cancer and lung cancer. So, this was something where I was being called, to act in a certain way. And I definitely saw online, you know, people who are on the front lines who are physically there. And I said, you know, I can't actually be there. I can't be there, but what else can I do? And I actually found my role and my place kind of being at home. And I found that I've been most effective at home, making calls, finding, you know, volunteers, supplies, funds, writing press releases. Not when you're on the front lines in a protest, you don't really have the same amount of time to sit down with a laptop and write a policy agenda. But that was something that I was able to do and push out and also support those who were there. And then also I got to be a step back as almost like an operator almost, when there were fires going out and going on, and you know there was gunshots ringing through town. People contacted me, and so I could contact those who are on the ground to get out or to find drivers, or you know I was messaging people, you know, the National Guard's on their way, you know, evacuate the premises, things like that. So I found that I was very effective, much more effective at home than when I was on the ground. The one day I was on the ground, we're protecting Black businesses, and mainly our security team is a lot of wonderful, particularly young Black men who, in a lot of ways, in other situations, society would, you know, deem as like thugs or, you know, discard. But in this situation, they really stood up and protected our neighborhoods. But they were looking at me like, oh, I need to protect this girl too, you know, like, and I wasn't really as helpful as I needed to be. But when I was at home, I was able to really support them. And so that's kind of like how I pivoted and how I kind of found my place in this movement.
That's great. Thanks. Thank you, Angela. And Derek, how have you had to pivot and maybe shift how you're working?
You know, I think about it in terms of just managing, you know, the anxiety of, you know, now you're in the house, there's really not much else you can do right now. So, you know, I think in some cases, you know, some businesses expect your work productivity to go up. Just given that, you know, what else is there to do, but, you know, you've got to really kind of figure out a time to kind of let yourself wind down, and kind of give yourself that space. And, you know, for school, for example, now that school is at home, the hours are now almost 24/7, right? A teacher or, you know, another parent knows that, you know, you're at home during this time. And so it almost allows you to be more flexible with your time in terms of them checking in or wanting to check in, but you still have to manage that, right? And so, you know, for me at least, you know, I've had, like, the site took the time that I would usually use to kind of, you know, prep for lessons, since the lessons aren't as long anymore. You know, it doesn't take that much time to kind of put stuff together, but you know, instead of, you know, using that time to kind of sit still more or less, you know, I'm using this time to think about, you know, how can I create a bigger impact? And so, you know, I think about my wife too, Rakaya, because she's an OBGYN at Maimonides Hospital here in Brooklyn. So, you know, she's going straight into COVID almost every day. And at its height, you know, she was very concerned about, you know, what she's bringing home, and you know, those interactions that, you know, only takes 2 seconds for somebody to touch you or cough on you, and for that, you know, to really start off a series of events. And so, you know, she's being careful, I'm being careful. I made sure to, you know, follow her orders whenever, you know, she told me, you know, whether a place was safe or not. And that's where, again, like managing that anxiety, like you want to go out, you want to be able to get things back to normal, but you know, the fact of the matter is that, you know, it's not going to be like that for some time. And so the best thing you can do for yourself is kind of sit with that, but then also think about how you might be able to use your energy elsewhere, and be able to think about where you can start to make smaller impacts and turn them into larger ones too.
Thank you both for, you know, sharing personally how the current health crisis is impacting you. Really appreciate that. And you both touched on, you know, sort of these different ways that you can think about engaging in community, doing the work that you're doing, and hopefully over the course of the Q&A, we'll be able to raise up some some examples and ways that people can think about being part of the change that they want to see in their communities. So you've given us some, I think, some interesting sort of perspectives for us to think about as we think about ways that we can contribute and lead during this time. So with that, we're now going to shift gears and continue the conversation by going to some questions that were submitted by audience members ahead of the discussion today. And we'll kick it off with a question from Menli Mansu, who's the Vice President of the Black Alumni Council at Columbia. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Manli. Hi, Manli.
Hey, everyone. This is Menli here. Angela, Derek, thank you for the work you're doing. Lisa, thank you for your great intro. So we can just go ahead and get started, get you folks some questions. This is a great question. The first one is really about action, right? Because this is about moving past just gestures. So what advice can you all offer to recent graduates and maybe not so recent graduates who would like to use their careers to advance anti-racist policies and behaviors, and maybe even pivot into some of the work that you both are doing? And when I think about that, if I could add a little twist to that as well, when we talk about using your career, if you could take it from the perspective of like one's personal brand and then also moving practical steps for moving within an organization.
I can hit on that one first, and hopefully it'll be helpful. For me, I'm in a white space, right? Like I am a Black man in a white space, and on top of that, I'm in education where there aren't a lot of Black teachers there, or Black male teachers, and so, you know, for me, being able to navigate that through those two spheres alone requires just a little bit more, you know, attention to detail in terms of how I'm presenting myself. What am I saying to, you know, the faculty body or the parent body or the student body, and understanding that, like, you know, for that particular day, I might be the only Black man that has spoken to those different people, right? And so understanding that there's impact there that should be taken seriously. And so, you know, for any of, you know, the folks watching, you know, you can clearly assess, you know, where some of the power balance is, and understanding that, you know, who's been here longer and who has that platform to be able to speak on issues, you know, might be something that you might want to just take some time to analyze, right? And think about, why is it that, you know, those are the ones that typically are more outspoken over somebody else that may have been here for, you know, 30 years, but, you know, the minute that you get on the topic of race, you know, they're usually somebody that's going to be in the back. And you don't necessarily have to engage, but just kind of thinking about, you know, what are some systems in place that allow for that type of silence to kind of promote yourself up through an area. And so, you know, as you guys go into your own spaces, just kind of think about, you know, who do I have close that, you know, I can just kind of bounce ideas off of, and starting there. And I think, you know, finding 2 or 3 people that, you know, you can have earnest and honest conversations about, you know, is a great way to kind of get you comfortable speaking things out loud and being able to say the word Black and brown without necessarily feeling like you have to cringe, but rather getting to a space where you know that, you know, I'm saying this because it's the right thing. And I don't have to necessarily worry about, you know, top down trying to pull me in and wanting to talk more about these things, but rather, like, you know, I've generated a small cohort of people that I know will support me through this endeavor, but I will also be able to support them too.
I will say, you know, being a graduate of Columbia University will get you in a lot of doors, but you still need to learn how to humble yourself and do research on the space and the place that you are hoping to dive into. And this is something that Derek had touched on earlier. But also, I would say, you know, don't focus as much on changing the world, but, you know, focus on changing someone's world. Focus on changing your community, your company, your, you know, your network. So, and I'm going to tell you that right there is really hard. And it's hard to kind of make a place for those who even come after you to have a better situation. And I would say also join the NAACP. And that'll be a way where you can find mentors, you can find other professionals who do this type of work and who also are professionals, like white collar professionals, but who are, you know, trying to better their own companies.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Minley.
I'm going to go to a few more questions that were submitted by audience members. And both of you, I think, touched on this in various ways, this question I'm going to ask, but what are ways that individual citizens can advocate for the change they want to see in this country beyond physically protesting? Not everyone is inclined to protest or can. I mean, Angela, you talked about some of the real personal reasons why it would be, quite frankly, dangerous for you to, you know, be out protesting in the street, given sort of health issues of family members, or contributing money, right, to Black Lives Matter movement or anti-racism or social justice organizations. Not everyone is in position to write that check. And as I think about the economic impact of COVID, you know, more and more people are economically challenged right now. And so the ability to do that is limited for many people. So, you know, beyond those two steps that people can take, which may be challenging for many, what are some other ways that you would recommend people think about if they want to advocate for change or, you know, be a part of the change, as I mentioned, that we want to see in the world?
I would say, you know, operate first and foremost out of a place of love and compassion, not fear or ambivalence. If you're going to do this, you know, do it. Don't do anything half, but, you know, really put your full commitment into it and focus on what you can do. The United States already has a system set up where everyone is supposed to be heard, and that's voting. And not only through voting, that's the first step, but there is a large number of ways to be civically engaged. So you can reach out to your mayor, your alderman, your constituent. So also, you know, you have power over your dollar. Where you put your money is extremely important. And sometimes that means more to some than just voting. So also, I mean, I think choose what you realize, that you also have power of what you say and what you perpetuate. So, you know, if you learned that the 5 Little Monkeys Jumping on the Bed song, the first, you know, iteration, the first earlier lyrics were 5 little darkies, 5 little N-words, you know, jumping on the bed, maybe you won't teach that song to your children. Maybe you won't perpetuate some of these things that are really ingrained in our society. I mean, just in how we subconsciously walk through spaces that have Confederate statues, do you realize that? Do you understand that in this space that has been shaped by white supremacy, what you can do to change that? And there's a lot that you can do. So really, you know, I think also the last thing would be collaboration is key. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So really think about the other people in your network who maybe you don't have a network yet of Black folk, of folk who are doing anti-racism work, but get one together and start in offering your skills, offer your knowledge, and offer your time, and offer to show up, because we need more people to show up more than anything.
Derek.
I'd add on to that in terms of like starting with your sphere, like just your sphere of influence. So like, you know, starting with just, you know, an understanding of your neighborhood, for example. You know, do I live around predominantly white people? You know, thinking about why that might be. Thinking about, you know, what are some of these services that are in my neighborhood that I know just down the street in a predominantly, you know, Black and brown neighborhood are not going to be there. And starting to think about, you know, what systems are in place that allow that to be. But then also branching out and thinking about your immediate friend group, right? And understanding, or is it segregated because these are just because of the people I work with? Do I already have a pretty integrated friend group? And I'm not just talking about race, but rather just thinking about difference of ideals, right? Do I have a system already where I can have a talk with somebody and they know that it's coming from a place of trust. And just like Angela pointed out, like, you want to make sure that your intentions are always first and foremost coming out of a place of understanding and wanting to do better for yourself. And I think oftentimes you get folks that get into the anti-racist work thinking that, I need to be at the front, I need to be, the face speaking out on this, and understanding that, that savior role can actually lead you down a bad path as well. And it allows you to get up front, but you stop listening, right? And so, because you believe that, you have to be the voice. And so during this time, it's always important to, be engaged, but also make space for other voices to come into that conversation too. And so, just like with my own students, it takes time. It takes time to build up the stamina to talk about race. And, even if you're not protesting, if anything, you're still voting. You don't necessarily have to be donating or, doing X, Y, and Z just to be able to show you're doing anti-racist work. That can actually tire you out rather quickly. And so you want to be able to use your own pace and understand that, I'm going to build myself a cohort of people that really do understand where I'm coming from in this situation, that are willing to work with me where I am. And then being able to say, like, all right, now that I have this, now they're going to hold me accountable and making sure that, I'm showing up to the voting booth. If there's something I should be doing in terms of like reading or having a small discussion group with somebody, setting something on your calendar where you're going to check in with that group, or even your own parents, because I think that's also a great way to kind of see the generational gap between you and them. And they might not necessarily know some of the things that they might perpetuate, but that might be a great way for you guys to start that conversation. And they might not get on, the same page with you immediately, but, as you continue to have those conversations, you're actually helping them to kind of reassess where their generation's coming from and how some of those things that were in play and that they benefited from, how those things show up in their daily lives too.
Thank you both for really highlighting the variety of ways that I think people can think about being engaged citizens. And, I always say to individuals when they ask me, what can I do? And I say, we all have a role to play. And it's a matter of pausing and reflecting on where you are at any given point in your life, where you're sitting at that moment. And assess and figure out what it is you can do at that particular moment in your life, knowing that life changes over time. It can get more complicated. You may have more time, 10 years from now, but that it's really incumbent upon us as citizens to really think about, how can I do my part? So thank you both for sharing.
No, I agree. I would say also, start with the networks that you already know. Like, we're in a Columbia network. And I'm a Barnard alumni, the Black Barnard alumni and Black Columbia alumni. They've put out a list of demands towards Columbia, right? This is something that you can do. I've been working with my high school, with a number of graduates from my high school, about putting out a list of demands on them as well. So really work with the group and the networks that you're in. There's no place there's no place on earth that's not touched by white supremacy, and there's no person, no institution that could not do better. So, take it upon ourselves to look to amplify, the demands, the list of demands on public safety and, hiring and diversity at Columbia and Barnard. Those are wonderful. Those are great steps to take. And, the work is already happening. So if you want to jump in, it's time to amplify. It's time to.
That's right. Thank you. So I think we have time for maybe one more question before we close out this part of the conversation. But from your perspective, what is needed to keep the momentum going from this current moment that we're in? We know that protest raises awareness and it makes demands for change, and it has spurred action by people who have power, people who are in positions of power. For example, we see cities across the country banning the chokehold, right, as a policing tactic, and several corporations and foundations are setting aside millions of dollars to give away to social justice organizations and organizations addressing economic disparity and other disparities. So how do we use the motivational energy of the protests on the streets to realize the kind of change in policies and practices that we all want to see and are needed to really sustain change over time?
I would almost say, like, I'm seeing a lot, and maybe it's because of social media, but there's a lot of like cosmetic diversity switches that are happening. So we'll remove the face off of this thing, or we'll flip around the names, or we'll stay away from problematic language. And while that at least helps businesses think about, like, what parts publicly facing are problematic, you need to be able to get down into the roots in terms of understanding how did this come to be, what systems are currently still in place historically that have allowed this kind of chain of events to happen. And those conversations don't happen overnight, but they can be long-standing. But that's where I think a lot of people in their own businesses start to think about, like, how do I get this conversation started? I think it's excellent to see the public out there, marching and really making sure that everybody's being held accountable that needs to be. But at the end of the day, if those people are watching and then they go into their business and nothing has been brought up, then more or less they're going to assume that everything's okay. And so there's power in numbers, and there's also, as Angela pointed out, there's the power of your wallet too. And so being very smart about those two things can really be able to, like, start to turn the tide a little bit, where businesses are starting to think, like, this is affecting my bottom dollar. Let's really start to have this conversation, and then hold them accountable while they're having the conversation. Because I think sometimes you get some businesses that are saying, we're starting it and we're ready to take off on it, but there's nobody necessarily holding them accountable, and seeing where that progress is. And so that's where a quick knock on the door from somebody in your workplace, and, like, I wonder how that conversation's going. If you can't be in the room, because definitely you would love to be in the room, but if you can't be, being able to check in and understand that, like, I'm with this business, I'm with this company, I want to make sure that they're doing what they said they were going to start doing, at the very least. And so as somebody that's an administrator at our school, it's something that I'm doing every day. We've had plenty of Zooms at this point to talk about, what next steps are, and putting those steps in the actual actionable steps. But it is about checking in, because this could easily fall by the wayside if, folks don't want to pay attention.
And Angela, anything you'd like to share about what's needed to keep this momentum going? And
I would say the major thing I think about right now in this movement, and a lot of the changes that have been made by governments, or even companies, I am very proud of the steps that have been taken, but also the thing is that we haven't really sat down or held these groups accountable to what the real problem is. So for public policy, there's a book called The Eightfold Path to Public Analysis, Policy Analysis. And one of the things is that is your policy that you're making really addressing the true problem? So you have to find out what is the true problem and name it. Is the true problem that the police are brutalizing African Americans, or is there actually a system that perpetuates the brutalization of African Americans in our country? And that system is our criminal justice system, which goes beyond just even policing, but goes to the adjudication of enforcement against African Americans and the prison system as well. So, if we're going to address, the police, we should address the criminal justice system. We should address, these things. If we're going to say, okay, well, what we're going to do, we're going to defund the police, and then it's going to fix how African Americans are treated by, the surveillance state, by, when they go to court of the judge, anything like that. And it really won't. but this is a step, and I love this step, and it's a good step. But I believe that when we're talking about momentum, let's attack the true problem, because these problems and these issues have been long-standing. So the only solutions have to be long-standing as well. And we have to keep going at it, because otherwise, we're going to be complacent.
And I think we have time for maybe one more question. And I think that your comments are a good segue to this question about having, I think what you're, I'm going to summarize sort of very quickly what you're saying is like, how do we have the right kind of conversation, right? And how do we focus on the right issues? One of the questions that we've received sort of from a couple of audience members is, how can I be an ally in this work? And maybe you could spend a few minutes talking a little bit about, what can individuals who want to be part of efforts to, make change in society, who want to be involved, who are not African American, what advice would you give them? What recommendations or suggestions would you give them? Derek, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. And I'm already thinking in terms, like the first thing I say is write, largely because that's a great, and I would say physically write something down, even if it's just a sentence or two, but really being able to kind of journal out like your progression through this is kind of how you can really help yourself in the reflection process, and being able to say like, this is where I'm at, and understanding that, it's not a binary, it's not a good or bad thing, but rather it's a spectrum. And I think a lot of times when we approach racism, either you are racist or you're not. And I think that binary is what allows like a lot of the gray area to show up in terms of white supremacy, and that subtle way that it might come into play. And so, being able to just write out and saying, this is what I do, this is where, I am today, this is how I feel. And then using that time to say like, all right, I should read about some of these things, and maybe they have a lot to do with what you already currently do. Or maybe it might be just, I need more perspectives. Getting a chance to kind of find some of those texts is something my own website does, but then also thinking about like, what perspective will help me in terms of understanding where I need to be. And I think being able to write out some of that stuff allows you to kind of reflect back like, oh, this is where I was just 3 months ago. And these were the topics that, I found very important. And this is what I've learned since then. Allows you to kind of get more into the academic space and thinking about how you can come into these conversations. And I think like your intention and your impact will be in line there, because you're making sure that it's built out of one, education, but then also trusting that you're gonna hold yourself accountable, but then the impact is going to be felt there because you're going to allow yourself to be able to be vulnerable enough to have that conversation, and people are going to see that, and they're going to want to be able to help you there because they've noticed that your energy is already in the right spot.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion, Derek, about writing down and reflecting on where you are at that moment, and using that as a sort of a first step to think about how you can engage. Thank you for that. And Angela, would you like to provide any recommendations for some of our audience members who asked about how can I be a good ally?
Yes, I mean, like I said earlier, this is the time to really put in the work. And also, this is not the time to be fragile, not to care as much about like appearances or, how you might be perceived doing what you really believe in. People are dying, okay? People are dying. People are being murdered in front of our eyes. This is not the time to take a step back and feel like self-conscious about what you're doing. This is the time to really put in the work. And for activists like me, I'm not here to really like, I'm not about to stop. I'm up every night, I'm up all day, and I'm not about to stop to educate you when you can educate yourself. But also, when we're talking even like about something, a little bit of a side tangent about like hiring, stop saying there's not enough diverse talent. There might not be, But don't tell me until you've gone to Morgan, you've gone to Howard, you've gone to Xavier, you've gone to the National Black Association of Journalists, you've gone to the National Latinx Association, you've gone to the AKAs, you've gone to the Alphas, you've gone to the Sigmas and the Kappas. Don't tell me that there's not enough Black talent until you've actually put in the work. You know, don't tell me that this is something that's not achievable until you actually put in the work. So like that is something that I really am calling on all of our white allies to do. Is this is not the time to be fragile. This is the time to be boots on the ground working.
I wish we had more time. Derek, Angela, thank you so much for participating in this conversation, and thank you for the work that you are doing every day to help our communities move forward, to help this country move forward, to make this country more fair and more just. So thank you so much. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Riley Jones, who's going to make some closing remarks.
No, this was amazing. So Angela, Derek, Lisa, thank you so much. Can we give them a virtual round of applause? So the next Columbia at Home event is Data for Good with Jeanette Wing of the Data Science Institute. That's tomorrow night, June 24th at 7 p.m. Eastern. You can visit alumni.columbia.edu to register. Thank you all for joining and spending your evening with us. And we'll open up the chat feature in Zoom so that you can share with the panelists and your fellow attendees any ways you've been trying to create change or any new ideas you have after watching this program. Talk to you soon. Take care.